Ardorn, The Broken Kingdom Chronicles. The Wanderer's Tale. By D.G. Martin. The dwarf looked up from the cards in his hand, his face inscrutable, as his opponents stared at him from across the table. Only one of them was confident about who would win the pot, and from an outsider's perspective, it was easy to guess which one. The man sitting across the table from the dwarf was visibly sweating. The roaring fire at the other end of the tavern's common area was doing its job to keep the room toasty and comfortable, but it was an unlikely factor in the man's current level of perspiration. "I call," the dwarf said, after several seconds of letting the man sweat out his night's ale intake. The man snickered a bit before laying his cards down on the table, displaying an impressive hand that the dwarf would be hard-pressed to beat. Several of the onlookers that the large game had attracted murmured back and forth, some convinced that the man was sure to win, others adamant that the dwarf had him beat. The dwarf stared long at the man's cards on the table, letting his eyes drift back to his own cards. He reached out with his other hand and grasped his beer stein, picking it up and throwing back a generous swallow of ale before setting the stein down and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The man was getting impatient and opened his mouth to say something. Before he could eke out a word, the dwarf threw his cards down on the table face up. "It looks like we'll all be having a round tonight with your gold, stranger," the dwarf bellowed as everyone stared down at the cards. The dwarf's hand was one of only a few that could trump the man's impressive play. As the crowd erupted in raucous laughter and cheering, the dwarf raked in his winnings and called to the tavern owner. "Hildo, I meant what I said. Let's have a round on this nice man's coin, shall we?" As the drinks were passed out and the next hand was dealt, the dwarf turned to the robed traveler next to him. "Okay, wanderer, it's your turn. Surely you have a tale of wonder and suspense to share with us, having travelled as far and wide as you say." The wanderer tossed a coin into the center of the table for the first ante and ran a hand through his wavy blond hair before answering. His attire clearly marked him as a traveler, but he had been seen rarely in these parts of late, his travels having taken him to the farthest reaches of the Broken Kingdom and its bordering lands. "Yes," the wanderer said finally, "I think I do have a tale to tell that might shock even the likes of you, Master Dwarf." The dwarf laughed again and took another draught from his stein. "Very well, then," the dwarf said, clearly thankful for the wanderer's respectful epithet. "Let's hear your tale, and judge it by its merit." "A few weeks ago, I was traveling along the border of the great southern forest." "You mean near the Elflands?" the dwarf asked. "Yes, just north of there. And I came upon a small farming village, just as all the townspeople were gathering in the marketplace to discuss an issue. I approached and stayed mostly out of sight at the edge of the crowd while I listened to their meeting. According to several of the farmers living on the farthest outskirts of the settlement, 5 children and some 3 or 4 dozen livestock had gone missing overnight, and the town was half convinced that the elves had finally grown hostile to their living so close to the border of the forest. "That's crazy talk, that is," the dwarf interjected. "I believe so as well. Now, please, stop interrupting me. I decided, after listening to a few of their wilder theories about forest spirits and rampaging dragons, to see for myself what would have taken the children and animals. Most predators only take one or the other, so there had to be more going on than what they realized. A half-hour's walk brought me to the outskirts of the settlement, and it took me little time to find the sites where the abductions had taken place. Though I could find clear signs that some kind of predator, or predators, had indeed made off with the livestock, I could see no evidence of the circumstances for the children's disappearance. After inspecting 3 farms, it was clear to me that the abductors, of both the livestock and apparently the children, had absconded into the nearby woods, into elf territory. I am generally on good terms with the elves of Elebrithel, and knew that they could not be the culprits in this, but it was very possible that someone wanted the villagers to think that they were. I set out for the woods by mid-afternoon. It was not long before I found a clue to the identity of the perpetrators. Buried into the tree trunk was a crude axe of the type favored by Oryx. "Oryx? In the forest? Methinks you tell us a tall tale, wanderer," the dwarf interrupted yet again. "I tell no such tale, Master Dwarf. the wanderer replied. "And please, stop interrupting me. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, the oryx. I was surprised to find such a weapon in elf territory. Oryx had not been seen this far south in over 100 years. If this was the work of such creatures, then something troubling was certainly afoot. I proceeded deeper into the woods, following a set of tracks that led south and east from where I had found the oryx weapon. This deep into the woods, they no longer feared being tracked from the village. People usually do not venture far into the woods for fear of upsetting the elves, but the oryx clearly had no such qualms. It was now near sunset, and the waning light was even darker underneath the canopy of the forest. I was forced to cast a minor spell to aid in my tracking, but even if they had a shaman or stargazer among them, I knew there was little risk that my tracking enchantment would be detected. Still, I doubled my caution. Shortly after dark, I came upon the sounds of two growling voices in conversation. It sounded like a gutter speech, not unlike a dialect of Orc that I had come across some years before, far to the north in the mountains of Darthrongaz, so I was able to make out some of the words. These two had been placed on guard duty in the unlikely event that someone from the village should track them this far into the woods, and they did not like being posted so far away from the hot food that awaited them back at their camp. Looking past their position, I was able to make out the glow of several fires. Their camp was only a few hundred yards away from where I crouched behind a tree, listening to the oryx converse. I was about to bypass their watch position when one of them spoke a word I was sure I heard before. "Darak Loch," he said. At the sound of the word I froze in place, momentarily stunned that I would hear such a word here. If I had heard what I thought I heard, then the camp would likely be one of the most dangerous places I had dared to tread in many years. Should the camp contain what I now feared it did, all of my attempts at magical subtlety had been for naught. Someone in that camp undoubtedly knew that a magi was nearby. While I hated giving up the element of surprise, I also welcomed the opportunity to approach a problem in a straightforward manner for once, and I stepped out from behind the tree into the full view of the oryx. "Hey there," I said casually. "Do you happen to know which way to the ocean?" Both of the oryx stared at me for a brief moment, stunned at my sudden appearance. Without answering, they both drew their short swords, nasty little blades with one side smoothly sharp and the other serrated in what I thought was an exaggerated manner. They both bellowed a short, guttural shout before charging me. This was the most action I had seen in a few months, so I selfishly let them get closer than I should have. I almost did not get my sleeping spell together in time, for when the second oryx dropped to the ground in front of me, his blade left a small scrape on my forearm. It was nothing major, hardly a drop of blood seeped out of it, but an instant haziness in my vision told me that I had another problem presenting itself. I was a fool. The blade was undoubtedly tipped with a poison of some type, but I had no time to worry about that. The whole of the camp surely knew I was there, which meant that only swift action would win the day. I set off towards the camp, hastily casting a cleansing spell that would help to dampen the worst effects of the poison. Without knowing exactly which poison it was, the spell would only work so well. By the time I reached the camp, it was in motion. Oryx were hastily preparing for a fight, and some of them rushed towards me the moment I was in view. Blue energy discs flew from my hands as I unleashed my own brand of magical counterattack, silencing the majority of my assailants. Armor is no good against a magical blade, after all. The others were stalled in their advance, having seen almost a half-dozen of their number cut down in a flash. I took advantage of the stall and scanned the camp for the children. The only completely enclosed tent in the camp was at the far end. Several crudely erected cages held what was left of the livestock and outlined a rough circle extending from the tent, forming the shape of the camp. 3 fires burned in the interior of the circle. Between the tent and me now stood over a dozen oryx, their burly forms starkly outlined by the firelight. Have you ever seen an oryx? Muzzle like that of a small bear, bulkier than a man, and covered in thick fur. Ghastly creatures to behold, and the subject of more than a few tales meant to frighten children of pretty much every race. Well, there they all were, standing between the tent and me, when a chill fell over the entire camp, followed by a dusky whispering sound. The aurochs cowered, and I shook my head to make sure I was not seeing and hearing things. Out of the tent, a black fog began to appear, wispy at first, but quickly it became the shape of something like a man. I say a man, but it was more like a shadow, something evil enough to not even be in the children's tales. What I feared was in the camp had revealed itself. A dark glow? A dark glow? The dwarf interrupted again. That's crazy talk, Magi. Those things haven't been around for thousands of years, if they ever were. The wanderer shrugged and looked at his cards, tossing another coin into the pot. If that's what you say, Master Dwarf, he replied casually, laying his cards on the table to run both of his hands through his hair again. Well, what happened? Asked the dwarf, echoing the thoughts of everyone in the room, who was now captivated by the wanderer's tale. The wanderer leaned back in his chair and smiled. I am here now, am I not? Oh, and I just called your raise, Master Dwarf. Tolak returned to his room much later than he originally intended. The dwarf had insisted on playing until everyone around the table told the room a story. Closing the door and sighing heavily against it, he stood with his eyes shut for several minutes before moving again. It was getting more difficult to block out the voice. Around other people it was easier. People spoke, laughed, made noises, and generally gave him enough distraction to shut it out, but the voice was still there. It usually waited until the quiet hours to become loudest, and the wanderer knew that tonight would be no different. Not forever. The voice, as if it was waiting on cue, sounded again. Tolak knew he was in trouble, and he needed help soon. The pendant around his neck was becoming more difficult to control, and he was worried that he might be around other people when his control finally slipped. How had he survived his encounter with the dark glow? Some might say he did not. Tolak knew he could not defeat the ancient evil by itself, but he tried anyway. He had no choice. The fight was nothing like he had ever experienced, and he quickly knew he was going to lose. The dark glow had such raw, dark power that all living things around it began to feel the effects of its energy as it leached the life-blood all around it. Grass, trees, insects, animals, and even the aurochs. Tolak knew a spell that shielded his life energies from being used to power his own destruction, but it was all he could do to defend himself against such an ancient and terrible evil. Tolak was not about to give up. Staring into the glowing eyes of his enemy, he did not back down. You have spirit. The dark glow's whispering voice had risen to a crescendo as it realized that Tolak's power would be an excellent addition to its own growing powers. And that had been the key Tolak was waiting for. Tolak had an idea to contain the dark glow, to trap it back in the pendant that it wore around its neck. All dark glows were bound to an object of some kind, and this one's pendant was right there for Tolak to take. And take it he did. With the dark glow concentrating on breaking down the last of Tolak's magical defenses, as swirling dark mist bombarded the blue shield of willpower that was the mage's last defense, Tolak took a gamble. He stretched out a hand and uttered the words of a teleportation spell, one that he had only ever seen in a book, but had never used himself nor seen it used. He did not even know how it was supposed to work, but Tolak had no other options. The dangers of using unknown magics were outweighed by his current predicament. A searing pain struck his right hand, and a bellowing screech followed afterwards. The dark mists receded and began gathering in a twister of magical winds above Tolak. Then, as swiftly as they had gathered, they rushed back into the pendant, taking the dark glow with them. Tolak blinked away the pain and looked to his hand to see the dark glow's pendant held between his fingers and his palm. He became the dark glow's master that day, but the terrible price of living through the encounter was already taking its toll. He could feel the dark glow worming into him, challenging his thoughts, wanting to corrupt his mind and his power. It was only a matter of time before it won out. Tolak needed a plan. He had to get back to the College of Mages, to his mentor, Grand Magus Telever. If any mage in Ardorn would know how to help him, it would be Telever. Tolak laid down on his bed and closed his eyes, hoping he could get at least a few hours of sleep before the voice became too much to ignore again. Tomorrow he would ride for Dalinar. The next morning, Tolak packed up his few belongings, mostly books and writing materials that he used in his travels and research, and bid farewell to the innkeeper Miles. The innkeeper was a long-time friend, and the mage enjoyed staying at Miles's place when travel brought him to the area. Tolak was not sure if Miles really knew what all Tolak did for the College of Magi, but he suspected that if the innkeeper had ever wanted to know, he would have asked. Miles prepared a road kit for Tolak to take with him, knowing that the mage would be on the road for a long time no matter where he was going. Tolak paid for the kit against Miles's insistence that the mage was too good of a customer to be paying for such things, but Tolak also knew that Miles needed the money and finally convinced the innkeeper to relent. The two shook hands, and the mage took his leave. Tolak stepped out of the back door and into the small yard that separated the stables from the inn. The morning was already bright, and Tolak wondered if he should not have slept as late as he did. Even though the day was not yet past the 9th hour, he still felt that if he had been able to get an earlier start, he would have felt better for it. He attributed his inability to wake up earlier to the pendant and its draining effects on his energy. Even so, his surprise at the sound of the voice behind him was troubling, because he had not noticed anyone approach.
"A good morning to you, Wanderer,"
a familiar dwarf voice said. Tolak turned around and nodded a greeting to his previous night's card-playing companion. "And good morning to you, Master Dwarf. I trust that your last night's winnings have not been lost in the hours since I left the table." With their game winding down in the early morning hours, the dwarf had decided to make friends with the new round of travelers who were just then making their way into the inn, and Tolak had bid the room good night. The dwarf must not have slept, and likely had not returned to his room for him to be sitting leaning against the inn's outside wall and puffing on his pipe.
"Oh, that lot?"
replied the dwarf, out the side of his mouth as the other half held the pipe.
"Nah, they ain't got a lick of sense about 'em. If I was an unscrupulous type, I could have taken 'em for more. But no, I wanted my morning pipe, so I retired out here to enjoy the sunrise."
The dwarf took another few puffs before speaking again.
"So I see you're leaving us again, eh, Wanderer? Where might you be off to this time? Somewhere exotic and dangerous?"
"Dangerous, perhaps," replied the mage, "but exotic, perhaps not. I am headed back home today. It is long since I last laid eyes on the college and my home city of Dalinar." The dwarf's eyebrows raised at the mention of Dalinar, and he stepped away from the wall.
"Dalinar, you say? Well, that's a token of luck, if you happen to consider it such. Dalinar be my destination as well. What say we make travelling companions?"
Tolak was used to traveling alone, and considering his current circumstances, he did not know if continuing to do so would be the best course or not. Alone, he would have to contend with the pendant and its inhabitant with only the sound of his own thoughts to help him. A companion along the road might serve well as a distraction, if nothing else, to help him push past the times when the voice was the loudest. Also, if it came to it, he did not like the thought of attempting to best the dark glow alone again. Though he might be putting the dwarf in danger by simply traveling with him, Tolak judged that the risk might be worth it in order to not be alone with his burdensome cargo. "Well," Tolak began, sounding as if he was still considering the offer, "I suppose such a fine storyteller as yourself would make a good companion on the road." The dwarf chuckled and put out his pipe.
"Very well, then. It's settled."
After stowing his pipe on his belt, he strode the few steps over to where Tolak was standing and extended a hand. Tolak shook the dwarf's hand and nodded. "Well, Master Dwarf, it will become tiresome being referred to as Wanderer for the rest of our trip. My name is Tolak, and I am pleased to make your acquaintance." The dwarf smirked under his black, grey-flecked beard and replied,
"My name be Lordreg. Most folk just call me Reggie."
"Well then, Reggie," Tolak said as he turned to the stables to retrieve his mare, "I see only my horse in the stables. Are you planning on making the journey to Dalinar on foot?" The dwarf let out a hearty laugh.
"No, lad, I'm not such a young dwarf any more. And even though we mountain dwellers like to keep up our image among you other people, I don't fancy a walk of that distance."
"Then what is your plan?" asked Tolak. Surely you didn't make friends with me just on the hopes that I would let you ride my horse the whole way there." The dwarf laughed again and put his hand to his lips. He let out a shrill whistle that lasted for a few seconds. Afterwards he crossed his arms and stared at Tolak.
"No, Midge Tolak, I'll not be walking much at all,"
Lord Reg said.
"In fact, it'll be you slowing me down."
As the dwarf uttered his last sentence, Tolak heard the strong wing beats of what he thought must be a giant bird coming down into the stables. As the beast landed, almost right on top of the dwarf, Tolak raised a hand to shield his new friend from the creature, but he stopped at the last second and marveled. In the middle of the courtyard, standing proud on 4 feet, was a sight even the Wanderer had seldom had the privilege to partake. A griffin of Dar Thrungaz, the dwarf kingdom, was rarely seen in any part of the Broken Kingdom, and Lord Reg's words suddenly became clear. "I take it you know each other," Tolak said, as he continued saddling his horse.
"Oh, aye,"
replied Lord Reg.
"Hammerwing and I go back a long ways. Longer than your life, by the look of ye."
"I bet you do," said Tolak, leading his mare out into the courtyard. When he had swung up into the saddle, he looked down at the dwarf and his griffin. "Perhaps you can tell me a story about one of your shared adventures with Hammerwing as we start our journey."